Hello and welcome to Counterculture. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, recently we had the local elections, which by and large were a big success for the Conservatives and a bit of a disaster for Labour. But what has happened, therefore, to the smaller parties that were standing? And indeed, what is the broader question when it comes to what you might call insurgent parties? Where is the next one actually going to come from? Because certainly in the past decade, British politics has been characterised by a number of parties coming up and then maybe disappearing. And also, for that matter, what is the future for conservatism as an idea? Now, to discuss this, I'm very pleased to have with us today, first of all, Robin Aitken, formerly BBC journalist and producer and a journalist now for the Daily Telegraph. Also, we have Patrick O'Flynn, who is a former political editor of the Daily Express, of course writes for The Spectator and the Telegraph, amongst others, and Rafe Hadelman-Koo, commentator and historian, of course, from the New Culture Forum. Can I start by asking you, Patrick, because this was slightly inspired by a piece you wrote in The Spectator, which was, where is the next insurgency going to come from? I just wonder, what do you think now, in light of the elections, where do you think it's going to come from now?
Well, I think the election results underline my basic point, which was the kind of new generation of smaller right-wing would-be insurgent parties haven't found an issue to give them traction, as we remember UKIP had with the push to Brexit, and the Brexit Party had with the push to get Brexit actually over the line. And they've taken various punts which haven't come good so far. Obviously, Nigel Farage, the one really, really famous person with an enormous following on the right, has stepped away for now. Whether it's for good, we'll see. And Richard Tice is the successor there. And Richard's really taken a punt on taxation and over-taxation and the potential for tax cuts being an issue where traction will follow, and that simply didn't happen in those elections. Lawrence Fox and Reclaim, didn't really generate much broad support either. And I think that those parties, there needs to be an amalgamation before they can even get going at all. And whatever you think about Reform UK and Richard Tice, they are the only one that features in opinion polls. I don't think any of the other parties, the Heritage Party, things like that, have ever even had any recordable support in an opinion poll. So although Reform is on 2 to 4%, it owns the banner. And if the parties of both the cultural and the economic right want to get going, they probably all need to agree that there's a banner in the sand that they want to rally what potential support there is around. And I don't even think they've reached that kind of base camp yet.
Were you surprised, actually, just when we think back to the elections in London? I was surprised, pleasantly surprised, but I was surprised that, that people always said, oh, these parties won't do very well in London. But then the Tories actually did remarkably well, actually, in London, didn't they?
Yes, and I thought, to be fair, I ended up giving Sean Bailey my second preference, having, really not liked him when he was almost praising the Metropolitan Police for taking a knee. And there were various other ideas which I didn't think were terribly good ones attached to him. But he showed a bit of gutsiness, I thought, as the campaign wore on. And he did indeed do very well, and I think particularly in the outer boroughs. And the idea that Sadiq Khan might win on the first ballot was swept away. But I think that reflects something that I've learned over the years, that the outer boroughs of London, the opinion as a whole in those places is not markedly different from the kind of less fashionable southern towns, or even, dare I say it, the Red Wall, particularly on cultural and social issues.
Although that is actually slowly disintegrating, isn't it, Rafe? The kind of what they call the donut. It's demographically changing as well, isn't it?
Demographically, it's changing. But I think the broader issue we have to be asking here is there any need for these right-wing parties? That's the view of a lot of people will be asking. especially our viewers and those who voted UKIP and voted Brexit Party, will be saying, well, what's the need? UKIP and Brexit achieved what they wanted to achieve. We've now got this stonking majority with Boris Johnson in Parliament holding the left to check. The left are now impotent. We see these headline-grabbing sound bites about, such as in the Queen's speech, about cancel culture being attacked in universities, about limiting asylum seekers crossing the channel. We've heard before about potential reforms to the civil service and to the BBC. So it seems on a superficial level as if there's no need for any more right-wing parties. Of course, the reality is this is all, in my opinion, fairly insubstantial policy in terms of the Conservative Party. We know full well that Boris Johnson is really a metropolitan liberal, as you've seen by his choice in girlfriend, the most tree-hugging Tory you could possibly find. There's no true conservatism in the Tory Party. Unfortunately, the Tory Party's great success, the reason it is the world's most successful political party, is it knows how to evolve and adapt. It's never been very closely tied to ideology, unlike the left, which is one of the reasons for their problem. And they've parked their tanks seemingly on UKIP's ground, and so they seem to be addressing all of the concerns and grievances of small c conservatives in that red wall. The reality is very different, but it really takes these smaller parties to reveal to the public just how thin these Tory party pledges are. Because, for example, on the university level, anyone who's banned from speaking at a university has to take this through the courts to get any financial redress. Yes. Who's going to go through that hassle? Yeah. And we've seen with Tim Davies, apart from cancelling the MASH report, there's no proper reform taking place at the BBC, as Robin knows. So those are the problems which are really afflicting and affecting these reclaim reform and the heritage, etc.
Would you say that Rafe, that it's a bit of a synthetic kind of conservatism, therefore, at the moment?
Yeah, very much. I mean, the way I see it is that Boris and the Tories benefited this time round, still in the backwash of the success of achieving Brexit, having delivered on that, but then the success of the vaccination program. I think, in a way, the election we had last week was masked some of the underlying real issues. So I think there's a real question mark about the authenticity of Boris's or the Tories' social conservatism. I mean, everyone is saying that it is social conservatives in places like Hartlepool who are attracted by this anti-woke Tory party. Well, how anti-woke is the Tory party? That's the real question. I mean, it's a question of authenticity. If people are talking about Starmer and Labour having this very awkward coalition of social conservatives in places like Hartlepool and then the woke social warriors down in London, right? But the Tories have a similar problem in a sense. We know that, most gut Tories, or a lot of gut Tory supporters, are what one would term social conservatives. Is Boris going to deliver on that? I mean, we didn't see that last week because there were other issues in people's minds. I mean, I think the vaccination program, I don't know if you'd agree. I mean, it seems to me, Patrick, that the success of the incumbent government, or the apparent success, and the vaccination program. No, let's not be mean-spirited. There has been a success with the vaccination program, hasn't there? And I'm sure that was a big factor in the Tory success last week.
Well, I'd agree with that to an extent. There's been a vaccination bounce, definitely. There's also, getting Brexit done. People watch Boris Johnson come through a heck of a lot of abuse and the establishment trying every trick in the book. And whether people say he doesn't believe in a lot or not, he had enough belief to deliver and, in a way, salvage British democracy from the elite to deliver a meaningful Brexit. So, and then, of course, he won his landslide. So I think people think Boris Johnson is a big deal Prime Minister. He's not just a stopgap. He's not a Theresa May. He's not a Gordon Brown. He's not even a David Cameron. He is potentially a Blair or Thatcher, an epoch definer. And these are early days, and they're tempted to roll with him for a bit. So I think in terms of the smaller parties of the right, they need to be sort of rooting out what the issues are that he's not going to cover. And I suspect actually that immigration control is going to come back as a big issue. People have talked about, you talked about him being a London Liberal, basically. Well, on his immigration policy towards migration from India, Hong Kong, Chinese, I think you're going to see an upsurge in immigration without necessarily the public infrastructure being expanded to cope with that. And we'll be back into just the issue that lit the touch paper for UKIP. And certainly none of the other parliamentary parties, which are all in the grip of no borders fanatics, are going to be taking him on that. So I think there is a gap there. It looks to me like Richard Tyson reform, it's not their natural territory. We'll see. I mean, I'm a member of the SDP, which is a bit left on economics, but to the right on culture, and very kind of sceptical about mass migration. But again, getting that to a position of having any traction does seem a long way off too.
Patrick's exactly right on this point, and I don't know why Richard Tice didn't seize that and heartily pull it. Well, it seems to be very clear to everybody that it's those sorts of issues which are far more cutting than pursuing a neocon Thatcherite idea of smaller state and lower taxes in that region of the world. Former Labour voters aren't going to be attracted by that offer. Similarly, I wasn't never quite clear why Reclaim would follow in an anti-lockdown policy as their central thing when most people in the country were actually happy with the levels that things were at. And if you're not appealing to the majority of people, you're always going to have a very slow, a very low uptake. I had huge hopes back in December when Johnson was. I was always aware of Johnson never being a true Conservative, but I had great hopes when I saw this red wall of new grassroots Tory MPs who were plugged into the needs and concerns of their voters, plus Dominic Cummings and the Vote Leave team who were very shrewd and knew full well the path to success. And had it not been for COVID and Barnard Castle, Cummings would still be there, would still be untouchable, and would still have had time to implement his policies in terms of the long march through the institutions, which I think is a 10 or 15-year project, just as it was a 10-year project for Tony Blair to turn things in his way. It requires the same amount of time, and we did have that opportunity earlier this year with Dominic Cummings steering things, and the purge of Carrie Simons and her team against the Vote Leave, in my mind, was tragic, because it really is going to show this Versailles court at number 10 disconnected completely from the population in the north of England. And that's why I think all of these headline-grabbing social conservative sound bites are meaningless, really, at the end of the day, because you aren't going to see any great change on immigration, which is the policy that should be adopted by right-wing parties if they have any hope.
Yeah.
It's interesting, as you say, about reform not being particularly inclined to take on immigration, but I don't think Reclaim is either. I mean, no one's particularly taking it on.
No, well, I mean, I think there's, I think that Priti Patel is offering some good cover to the government on that, because I think most observers take her as pretty authentic on that issue. I don't read Priti Patel as anything other than a fairly hardline Home Secretary who wants to deliver on limiting immigration. I mean, like Rafe, I was very disheartened actually when Dominic Cummings was defenestrated. Basically because I think he's one of the few people of the last 3 or 4 decades who really gets what a problem the BBC is. And I thought his tactic, which he enforced when at the beginning of last year, when he was starving the Today programme of government ministers, that was a very effective thing to do to the BBC. It was very effective. And I mean, I wrote about this also, and about the way in which the BBC really set out to get Cummings. I felt that there was a definite campaign to delegitimise him over the Barnard Castle thing, and I suspect that the reason for that, part of the reason for that, I mean, there were journalistic reasons to go after him. I accept that. I also think that within the BBC, they saw Cummings as somebody who was a real threat to the corporation. And it was no coincidence that the BBC mounted that fierce campaign against Cummings over those months, over something which really, frankly, when you look at the substance of the allegation, they were piffling. And any father in his position of a young child like that, I thought it was entirely legitimate what Cummings did, actually. But, there was rejoicing, I am sure, in BBC corridors when Cummings was given the heave-ho. And I think it's an enormous shame. Although, just as a final point, I would say that the installation of Robbie Gibb as one of the unitary board members at the BBC last week or 2 weeks ago, I thought that was an encouraging sign, because I don't think Robbie Gibb knows where the bodies are buried in the BBC. He knows what he's about, that bloke. And when he was head of BBC Westminster, he made it known that he wanted there to be a different approach to Tory issues and Tory politics. And I have some hope that the reform programme within the BBC has not entirely expired with the departure of Cummings.
It feels to me like they row back, actually, again, going back to this synthetic point, that they were really going to be tough on the BBC, and this sort of thing. And there was talk of decriminalising the licence. But I think that's been kicked into the long grass, hasn't it now? I mean, do you just go back to that point that Rafe made, actually, Patrick, do you think that it was wrong for the smaller parties this time to coalesce, which they all seem to do, around the lockdown issue? You saw these demonstrations of reclaim and reform, and it was sort of seemed to me that, when it came to actually support for that in the country, it was quite obstinately always around about 20-30%, wasn't it?
Yes, and I think as time went on, probably dipped below that. And I think that showed that just as there is a liberal left Twitter bubble, there is also a right Twitter bubble as well, which was very galvanised around anti-lockdown, even to the point of punting conspiracy theories about COVID on its fringes. That's not so. There is a serious point about the dictatorship of the majority that we should all talk about post-COVID. Just because 65% of people might say they want to legally ban you from stepping outside your front door, is that a legitimate reason for a law to be passed to prevent you doing that? And what core of individual rights supersede that, and how severe does an emergency have to be for the government to do that? And none of that really got talked about. So there was certainly an intellectual point about liberty there, but in terms of it having mass purchase, no, it didn't. And I think it's kind of undermined the potential breadth that something like Reclaim can manage. I don't think necessarily Richard Tice's credibility was harmed particularly, and he seemed to articulate anti-lockdown in a slightly more nuanced way. But no, it wasn't a winning horse, that's for sure.
It sort of seems to me really that they're sort of out on a limb, these parties. But you mentioned a banner issue, in fact, immigration. Is that the only one? Is that, if you're looking to the future, once this euphoria has gone away from the elections and the Tory success and everything, what issues? I mean, to me, it seems that people are... Actually, you mentioned in your article, Patrick, there's not enough disgust around, I think, is what you said.
There isn't much. And I think
I see disgust everywhere.
I think in general there's not, because I think actually that Boris Johnson is a kind of brilliant centrist. He I mean, even on environmental stuff, where again the right Twitter bubble thinks he's bankrupting the country and it's all nuts and this stuff. If you look at the polling, I was looking at the underlying issues polling today. Concern about the environment is now number 3, and he's got it covered. And he's got it covered in a way that the voters see annoys the Tory right. His ultra-Keynesian response to the COVID crisis annoyed the Tory right, but that largely seemed to come through okay. And yet he annoyed the liberal left massively by delivering Brexit. I think he has got a blend of issues in a sort of pragmatic, Disraelian way that do constitute a sort of conservatism, and it's the sort of and general sense of patriotism and being happy with the flag and all that Labour aren't, and it's the conservatism that keeps Labour out and prevents the country from really going into a socialist tailspin, and that's always been one version of conservatism, and he's a master of it.
But do you not feel that, Robin, that people are? I get a feeling of intense anger and exasperation. I mean, this isn't just me looking in the mirror. I do sort of feel on the issues of free speech, on the issues of trans, on the issues of all these things, day in, day out. It's never ending.
I agree with you, and I think that there is albeit a minority, a growing minority, which is fed up to the back teeth with wokeism. And these issues, the ones you mentioned, these are the things which really animate a real sense of anger amongst a minority of people, and they tend to be on the right. It's absurd, isn't it, that free speech is regarded as a right-wing issue. I mean, just saying that it's such an OTO's construction that, of course, it's not all right. Free speech is an issue for everybody, and I think that the salience of that issue will, in time, animate the left also, because it's interesting that across the water in Washington, there are now voices, even within the Democratic Party, who are raising concerns about, for instance, what happened with Trump and Twitter and the other big Silicon Valley companies which have banished the man, and that is something which, whatever you think of Trump. I actually happened to be I was rather a fan of Trump, so I was outraged by it from the beginning. But people on the left can see the dangers of that, surely. I think the salience of that issue will rise. I mean, just on this question of the minor parties of the right, to me, I think there isn't at the moment an issue around which they can coalesce properly. I think in time, the tax issue, which has been identified by Reform and by Richard Tice, that's an issue which might, in a few years' time, have more salience, because, there's a big punt, isn't there, on the economy at the moment. We don't know what's going to happen to inflation. We don't know what the Treasury is going to have to do about raising taxes to cover all this money we've spent on furlough and all those kind of things. Now, if at some point the tax rises begin to rub, and they begin to rub on ordinary middle-class folk, that's a point at which you could get an issue which really gave something for a party of the right to run with. We're not there yet.
And the problem with the small right-wing parties is that the Tory Party is appearing to tackle cancel culture issues, is appearing to tackle woke issues. They have the union flag behind every MP when they speak on television. You're seeing these headline-grabbing sound bites. And of course, we know that that's not the reality. But also at this current time, he's got Brexit done, and the vaccination program is going pretty well. The people are grateful for the furlough scheme and the fact that people haven't got high unemployment rates. The economy is doing hopefully very well. We're supposed to have the biggest rebound, I think, in Europe. In my view, unless immigration and work issues on their own, I don't think are big enough of an issue to get people to vote for a party, right? The work issues are an annoyance for a lot of people, a huge frustration. But I can't see that as on its own. Tied with immigration, possibly there's an opportunity there. But I would imagine, unless immigration gets completely out of control, easily be 10 years or so before you get the growth of an issue similar to Europe, which caused UKIP's rise. There's 10 years now of Tory rule. What used to annoy me for the past 15, 20 years was in every manifesto of the Tory Party, there was a pledge to lower immigration. At the end of that 4 years, they had broken that pledge phenomenally, and they again made a similar pledge. And I thought, at what point are people going to realise they are lying blatantly? So even immigration, I do wonder about whether that's actually, even that's going to be sufficient of an issue.
And I think as well, the Tories clearly have a talent for shape-shifting. And if there is a bit of traction picked up on tax cutting, then Rishi Sunak may discover he's more of a tax cutter than Boris Johnson was. Liz Truss will step to the fore. Sajid Javid might be recalled. And they'll suddenly all believe in galvanising incentives by lowering taxation, and the small business community might say thank you very much to the little party that put it on the agenda, but come polling day in a general election, all of history tells us it's better the devil you know, and they'll go back to the Conservative Party.
The thing is that with the Tory Party, you can't keep away from it, can you? I mean, the thing is with them is that they have got this ability to give the impression. Look at the Queen's speech, in fact, not unlike the SDP, tackling right culturally, tackling left economically, but very skin deep. And they manage somehow to give this impression. But actually, when it comes to it, I mean, it is really, there's not very much there. And I think there will come a point maybe surely where people sort of see that and sort of, what do we hear all the time? Going back to UKIP days was why do you trust the Tories all the time? Why do you keep trusting the Tories? If you look over to France, I mean, you can see an issue there, where there seemed like whole parts of the army are writing letters to the government saying that the country is disintegrating.
Yeah.
This issue, which is the one of radical Islamism, whatever you call it, what you want, has taken a real backseat.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
This is one that actually could arise again, is it not?
Well, it is, but I mean, you only have. I mean, you have to stand back sometimes and just admire the sheer slipperiness of the Tory Party on these issues, and that sounds like a very pejorative thing to say, but what I mean is, the way to success in British politics is to occupy the centre ground, isn't it? To actually construct a coalition which is going to give you a majority in the first past the post system. And the one thing you mustn't do is scare the horses. That's the thing. You can't frighten the horses. So issues like immigration, issues like Islam, radical Islam, if the Tories were to come out too vigorously on those issues, there would be a backlash, and that's the thing which they want to avoid. And the success of the Tory Party is, pundits are always saying this about how it's the most successful political party in the Western world. That's true, it is actually, and it's shown itself to be resilient, and it shapeshifts all the time. It tacks with the wind, whichever the way the wind is blowing, and
so in
that's
other words,
why
totally lacking in principle is what you're saying.
Right. Well, it's sort of, I mean, the thing is, but do you not, the thing is, if politics is about, if being in power is the whole point of it, isn't it? And they are, and they have been, and they probably will be for the next decade. Well, that's what political success looks like.
Churchill once said, it's very hard for a nation to look up to somebody who always has his ear to the ground. But that has been the secret to success for Boris Johnson, certainly. And it's that shape-shifting nature of the Tory party, which I think the smaller parties should use to their advantage, because it's a mistake to view these parties as rivals or alternatives to the Tory party. Our electoral system simply alone means that there's absolutely no chance that they're going to get into power. Rather than alternatives, I view them more as regulators or as quality commission, quality control commission. Just as UKIP, if it wasn't for UKIP, there'd have been no EU referendum, right? Brexit Party was there to keep their feet to the fire. And so on things like, if they are going to shapeshift on immigration, let it be these parties that threaten their majority, and only then will you see change. And that's really the dynamic, that I
in both of those cases, the UKIP and then the Brexit Party, in some ways, I mean, the Brexit Party came up like that, didn't it? Largely because of Nigel Farage, but it came and it did what it was meant to. It basically kept them honest, didn't it? But the interesting thing here, surely, is that you say that it's got to be these pressure groups, essentially. But then you look at the left, and they do have an array of parties, actually.
With traction, with representation. I think it may be that the logjam is more likely to be broken on the left, because the Labour Party is going to have to start justifying its position as one of the big two parties, and it's going to lose a fifth general election in a row. I think it will lose at least as badly as it lost in December 19, which will take the sixth general election in a row out of their remit. And you have, the Greens now getting traction, representing this tribe that Robin was talking about, the urban graduate liberal left, in rather an exciting way for them, and they're not lumbered with all this Labour Party baggage. So it may be that something breaks on the left, and then it filters across to the right somehow and opens up new opportunities in ways that we cannot at the moment foresee. But I think that's a more likely thing. Is Labour? It won't disappear, but it might become a party of 150 seats maximum, and there's room for other things.
I think this is a fundamentally important point, right? UKIP and then the Brexit Party came closest to breaking this two-party system that we had. If you look at the Brexit Party, had Theresa May remained in power, or had Rory Stewart succeeded her, there would have been over 100 seats for the Brexit Party. Boris Johnson was the only Tory party leader candidate who was assured to secure a majority. All of the rest would have basically started perhaps the inevitable decline of the Tory party. Now, would that have been a good thing or a bad thing? What we have to realise is, despite what we've seen in the local elections, a minority of people in this country vote for centre-right parties. The majority of people in this country vote for the left. So the first past the post system gives us this false idea that this is still a naturally conservative country, when we know full well that 60% of this nation vote for left-wing parties. The Conservative Party's success is the fact that there's a fragmented left between the SNP, Greens, Plaid Cymru, Labour and so forth. If you could take up all the parties who voted in the local elections, fewer than 37% voted for centre-right parties, and you had 64, 65 voting for parties on the left. And this is the same with any general election. It's the fact that the Tories have this ability to secure a majority government with 36 or so percent of the population voting that gives a Tory majority. So if there was to be any electoral reform, for example, and you were going to open it up to the fact, because it was grossly unfair against natural justice for UKIP in 2015 to secure 3.8 million votes, which is equal to the combined votes of the SNP and the Lib Dems. They got 64 seats between them, and there was one MP for UKIP. That's unfair. So you can understand why you would want to have proportional representation. But if you do that, then say goodbye to any future right-wing government in this country. You would just have successive Labour and left-wing coalitions, and that's a sad reality.
I do take issue slightly with this idea. People vote for left-wing parties. They might not perceive them as left-wing, because the fact is that 65-70% of people, for example, didn't want the songs at the proms to go. I think that's far more of a guide. Actually.
Sure, but I don't know anyone who wouldn't say that Labour, Lib Dem, SNP, Plaid Cymru and the Greens aren't left there, right?
No, but
I think the
isn't
Greens,
Rafe,
I think probably some people.
Isn't the point though, Rafe, that some of these issues we've been talking about, like free speech, for instance, or immigration, some of the people, so if you vote for the Greens, you're not necessarily somebody who wants to see an end to female lavatories. Not necessarily.
Although the Greens and their activist base are probably the most militant
they are, but I'm talking about the voters. Party. Right.
So to an extent, some of the voters might not be voting for that reason.
So if you say, well, 60% of the voters vote for left-wing parties, what I'm saying is that is true at a factual level, so can't be argued with. You're right. But there are issues which cut across all parties and underlie the headline voting patterns, so that what we're talking about is cultural politics, aren't we? And so these can't be pigeonholed. It isn't the case that only people who vote Tory are worried about free speech. It's not only it's not only Tories who worry about gender issues and this idea that we can be whatever the hell we want to be just at the drop of a hat. That's
absolutely correct. But these are still left-wing parties. It's always a minority of people who vote for those parties who are not from the left. For example, I think it was 1/3 of Green Party voters were pro-Brexit.
Yeah, well,
25% of SNP voters were pro-Brexit. These are substantial minorities, but they are still minorities, and they don't carry the day when it comes to the manifestos of those parties. So yes, absolutely, free speech is not a right-wing issue, but my point is, or woke or transgender rights, but my point is the very battle that's going on within Labour right now between social conservatives and the woke. That's being replicated in other parties where the distinction is even more extreme. And I'm sorry, but I don't believe that people who may be slightly concerned about these issues are going to carry the day when it comes to the manifestos that will be implemented by these future left-wing governments.
If you accept that, for example, Labour might always be at 150 or 200, it becomes a kind of zombie party, never quite get there. Isn't it the case that one thing that could happen is that they could adopt a policy of total electoral reform? It could then be in their favour.
They could do. They could think there will come a parliament and an election where us plus the SNP plus the Liberal Democrats, Greens, Plaid, SDLP will get 326 seats. We'll change the electoral system. And then it's under new rules. Exactly. And that could have, I don't quite agree that then we're kind of anchored with a left of centre majority in Parliament, because I think political opinion in those parties, if they did implement some of the more extreme woke ideas, might shift to the Conservatives and other parties of the right in bigger ways than they have done yet. But we're into a new world then, that's for sure.
In previous decades, I might have agreed with that. The problem is, we have not only a cultural divide in this country, we have an age demographic divide. And the fact that the younger generation, particularly the university educated, I mean, what was it when Corbyn was elected? If those under 25 had been the only ones to vote, there would have been 500 seats for the Labour Party.
Yeah.
And that's my concern, is that what you're saying is correct, but as the years go on, there's inevitably going to be a lurch to the left, as we're seeing, because of, I call them indoctrination camps, you might call them universities, and the teacher training colleges, we know, where fewer than 10% of teachers vote Tory. And I think this is where the Tory party can't be complacent. And I think it is complacent. It's resting on its laurels that it has this huge majority. But if it doesn't tackle the time bomb of the younger generation's political allegiances, then the Tory party is on short time.
I think apparently as well, Ed West has pointed out that in fact, this whole thing, you're left-wing when you're young and you become more conservative. Apparently that's not happening this time.
No.
They're sort of staying into the 30s and 40s.
That might be because they're delayed in becoming owner-occupiers.
Yeah, it's time they grew up.
I mean, and housing policy, therefore, could become crucial. And whether the Conservatives are so in the pocket of the big developers for various reasons that they're always talking a good game and never delivering, that's an issue that, if I was Keir Starmer, I would come up with a really massive house building policy concentrating on council houses as an issue that could perhaps unite the metropolitan left and working class communities as well, for instance, which he hasn't come up with any policies at all, has he?
Can I sort of finish by asking you just one thing? It might seem very a superficial consideration, but maybe not. What do you think the effect on this of GB News will be? Do you think it'll have any effect on this kind of discourse? And these outcomes we're talking about?
Well, I'm devoutly hoping so, because I think, from my perspective, I think that the left has owned the game, the broadcasting game, for decades, and there has not been a platform for I was just going to say right-wing news. What I mean, really, is news that fairly reflects the issues which concern people like us on the right. And GB News, we have yet to see it, we've yet to understand it, and I think the problem for me, I think, with GB News, I fail to see how it's going to make money. That's really...
That's a different programme.
We'll
get there at a different time.
But I have great hopes that it is going to redress the balance to an extent.
Look, put it this way. This election, turned on the news. A friend said to me, turned on the news, and they thought, am I in an alternate universe? Because the news was about this great Labour surge in Wales, right? They had sort of basically, very much gone and emphasised that. What do you think about it? Do you think it's going to make a difference enough to make a difference to our general political culture?
I think there's a potentially very large audience for it, and I hear that Andrew Neil is deadly serious about not being rushed and getting it right. I know they're aware, don't just become the Fox News of the UK. I think that's quite right. They need credibility, and just by being more balanced than the existing broadcasters, they will be, quote, more right-wing, because the liberal left agenda completely dominates not just the BBC, but Sky and ITV News, Channel 4 News completely. So I think they have a very large potential market share, but I do hear what Robin says about, are they going to make money? And I've read articles from people fairly expert in their business who can't work out how they would.
No, I agree completely. I think it's exciting. I'm looking forward to it with eager anticipation, and I think it's crucial that they avoid going down anywhere near the sort of path that Fox News has done if they're going to have any credibility in this country, because this country is a lot more centrist than America is as a whole. And so if they are to also sway minds and hearts, it's important that they actually do have that balance. And I think that's why Andrew Neil's going about it in exactly the right way.
I think the point being is that they might start covering stories that basically make the centre-right agenda wider.
Yeah.
And that can only help us. Anyway, we shall see. I think it's the autumn is coming, isn't it? But Robin, thank you very much. Patrick, thank you. Rafe, as always, thank you. That's it for this week. Please do remember to subscribe, won't you? But we shall see you next time on Counterculture. Thank you.